Hi, good afternoon and welcome. It's a very great pleasure to have you all here for the third and last of the semester of the School of Business and Economics speaker series. This afternoon we have Professor Zach Gochenour. I think I pronounced that correctly. It's not that easy to spell. It's a Swiss-French name, and he's a professor of economics at James Madison University in Virginia. He's a fairly recent graduate of George Mason University, also in Virginia, and for several years he was my colleague at my last school, Western Carolina University in North Carolina. So I've known Zach for a few years. And, I knew he had this research interest in immigration, and this is one of our, programming themes for this semester, so I thought it was a particularly interesting thing to have him come and talk to us about. So without further ado, Zach Gochenour.
Thank you, Dr. Mulligan. So I'm very happy to be here in the Midwest, enjoying your beautiful weather. Honestly, I really do like the temperature, but I can maybe live without the rain. I'm sure you guys can agree. And yes, I started my interest in immigration when I was in graduate school, and I was thinking, what am I going to research? And my advisor told me, pick the topic you think is the most important topic and research that. To do anything other than that is silly. And I was like, you're right. I should just pick the topic that I'm most interested in, that I think is the most important, and that's immigration. So since then, I guess, wow, it's been 7 years now since I started working on my first paper on immigration. I have looked into the economics and politics and history of immigration, particularly to the United States of America. Okay, so this research started as part of my dissertation, and I have continued this program because I found it very fascinating. I've brought some techniques from political science, from history, and of course my own training in economics in order to attack this problem with all the possible tools that I can. So the title of the talk is The Political Economic History of American Immigration Policy. I'm going to go back a long ways, to start it out, to my very favorite presidential election. Okay. Now we all just lived through a particularly contentious presidential election by our standards, and you might have thought that it got pretty nasty in many ways, but I will tell you that it was nothing compared to the election of 1800. Okay, in the most recent election, one of the candidates referred to the other candidate as a nasty woman, and that became a big deal, right? Well, in this election, Thomas Jefferson, founding father Thomas Jefferson, referred to founding father John Adams as a hermaphrodite in newspapers, in interviews, etc. And these sorts of insults were being slung left and right. Not that that's like even the worst possible insult, but it was of course made up, meant to defame the character of John Adams. They became friends again later in life, but at this time they were definitely not friends. And one of the big issues of this election was immigration policy. The Constitution itself doesn't really provide any kind of federal structure for limiting immigration whatsoever. And as Thomas Jefferson was very clear during this election, one of the reasons for the split from Great Britain, written in the Declaration of Independence, was that the king was trying to limit immigration to the U.S. states. And he said that was denying the basic liberties of self-government in the United States, and that as Americans, we don't do that. At the time, though, President John Adams had a big problem with French people. Okay, not just like he was racist against French people or something like that, but the United States was fighting an undeclared war with France over debt. Essentially, the United States had borrowed a tremendous amount of money during the Revolutionary War in order to fight against Britain, and much of that money was borrowed from France. And then after the French had a revolution of their own, where they killed the king, the Americans got the bright idea of, oh, well, we owed the money to the king, so we don't have to pay you back any of the money that we owe you. French got pretty upset about this, and for a while there was a bit of discord, I guess you'd call it. We called it the quasi-war. It was not declared on either side, but there were several naval engagements. And during this time, President John Adams passed a number of acts that he and his party, the Federalist Party, supported. one of them called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Essentially, his argument was sympathizers from France were coming over to the United States, writing nasty things about him and putting them in newspapers, and he wanted some kind of federal ability to restrict who is able to come into the country. Thomas Jefferson and his frequent co-conspirator, James Madison, who my university is named after, wrote some anonymous letters called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, where they basically threatened to secede. This is like the first seeds of succession, and they would have been referred to again during the Civil War if John Adams wouldn't step back from all of his anti-immigrant talk. Several people were imprisoned over the Alien and Sedition Acts. However, Thomas Jefferson won this election. He pardoned everyone who was imprisoned under the acts and actually paid their legal fees and said, as Americans, we will not limit immigration. This is not what we're about. We'll never do this again. And that's basically how things went for a long time. Of course, by the end of the 19th century, this is a painting or etching, I guess you might call it, called From the Old World to the New. In the 1890s, this was created and shows massive amounts of people coming to the US from Europe. And I'll talk a bit more about this situation after I build up various steps that got us here. So in the colonial era, there was very, very little immigration from anywhere other than Northwestern European countries. Okay, you had a number of British immigrants, primarily economic migrants. At the time, there was not a lot of land available in Britain. So if you wanted, if you didn't inherit any land and you wanted a better life for you and your kids, you thought, well, I'll just go over to the U.S. I guess that wasn't the U.S. at that time. I'll go over to the colonies, the 13 colonies, and I'll establish a new life for me and my children. A lot of the migrants were also religious migrants who faced various sorts of persecution in their homelands. It wasn't all British, but primarily British. Some German, but they did not come over in large numbers from any other country. And there wasn't a big movement to restrict immigration from Britain. Actually, there never was and never has been and probably never will. Okay, by the time of the early Republic, so after the Revolutionary War, say at the time of the 1800 election, we start to get a lot more immigration coming from other countries other than Great Britain. Okay? So we get a bit of immigration from France. So we start incorporating new parts of the country that have Spanish-speaking people, and we start incorporating more parts of the country that have French-speaking people. And these communities attract more people into them from Europe. Right. Also, the time of the early Republic was a great time of unrest in Europe. So you had people fleeing from famines. You had people fleeing from just overpopulation. Okay, so a lot of people, not a lot of work available. One thing that I've learned in my research on the economics of all of these eras that had high levels of immigration is that the biggest predictor of whether or not people will want to immigrate is something that we economists call the place premium. That is, how much do you get paid for your labor, for the same labor? So if you are in one of the German Palatines, there's no such thing as Germany at this time, but there are several little states, and you have a job as a farmer or a carpenter or something like that, and then you hear that you can make 2 or 3 or 4 times as much money for doing the exact same job if you just move to the American colonies, that starts to look really attractive. Especially when you're worried about civil war, you're worried about possibly being taken over by some other larger state and losing all of your property. This starts to look like a really attractive proposition. The main thing holding a lot of European immigrants back is the high cost of travel. So in the early days, so the late 1700s, early 1800s, there is quite a bit of growing immigration. Every year there's a bit more than the last year, but it is strongly limited by the fact that it's very, very expensive to get from the European continent all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So if you don't have a bit of money, or you're not willing to sell yourself into what they called indenture, so a period of temporary slavery to some landowner who already lives in the American continent, it's just it's not practical to make this trip. So there's no restriction, of course there's no legal restriction during this time period for moving, but there's a practical restriction in that it's just very, very, very expensive. Okay, so once again, we're getting economic considerations are driving how many people are thinking about moving to the American continent. And forget about it, if you're from Asia or Africa, the chances of you having any kind of ability to make the trip itself, or once you make the trip, having any ability to get work is just totally off your radar. Okay, so while there is a little bit of immigration, I mean, I'm not trying to say there were literally 0 people from anywhere other than Europe. It's pretty small. Okay. 1850 to 1930 is the period where we have the largest amount of European immigration to the United States. And this is also the period where we start to see restriction. So kind of the rest of my talk is going to be about the restrictions, how, when, and why they were passed in response to what political and economic conditions we were seeing. And you get still plenty of immigration from Britain, but the most common, there's the German flag. Of course, once again, not until the later part of the 19th century is there even such a country as Germany. Irish immigration becomes really big. You guys are probably familiar with some of the stories of the Great Potato Famine and other things that were causing people, mostly poor people, to move from these European countries to look for better opportunities in the United States. And absolutely there were better opportunities in the United States. Think about I'm going to use another econ jargon term here, but I'll explain it. The marginal product of labor in the United States was so much greater than it was in Europe, because Europe was quite saturated with people. But in the United States, there's plenty of land. There's also plenty of innovation. By this time, we're seeing some significant amount of industrialization. And the real thing that they're lacking is people. Okay, so you can make a lot of money doing the same job by moving to a place where that work is more highly valued. And even though it costs a lot of money, you're still willing to make that trip. Another thing that happens during this time period is that high cost of travel comes plummeting down with the invention of steamships. Okay, so these steamships you didn't have to have a lot of money, nor did you have to sell yourself into any kind of indenture to make the trip. So as the cost, when you think about your demand curves, right? So as this price is coming down for making the trip, the quantity, the number of people who want to make the trip is growing and growing. And it's expanding beyond the traditional countries like Britain and Ireland, and starting to incorporate more areas like the German area. By the way, I think even today, German ancestry is the most common form of American ancestry. It wasn't until 1875 that any kind of movement towards passing federal level legislation controlling immigration took off. And the first group to be targeted were Chinese economic migrants in the American West. Okay. As you may know, Chinese migrants came to the American West primarily to help build the railroads. Okay, the transcontinental railroads, it's hard work, and you need a lot of labor in order to do it. And where were they getting that labor? Who were they finding who was willing to do it? Well, there were a lot of Chinese men, primarily, almost exclusively men, which became part of the problem because they were said to increase levels of prostitution and things like that because they didn't have their families with them. Whether that was true or not, sort of immaterial. This is what people thought. So in the American West, the first act that was passed was the Page Act in 1875, but it was determined to be unconstitutional. And the Page Act sought to limit Chinese immigration to the United States. And it was a California Congressman Page, I think it's Robert Page, but don't hold me to that. That might be like a guitarist or something. So Page said, we should be able to do this because we need to protect the interests of white American laborers in the American West. And what's happening is, especially as the railroads start to be completed, they start and they look and they see, okay, these Chinese immigrants are starting up laundry services, they're starting up businesses, and people start to get very resentful because they say, these aren't Americans, they're here, they're taking away economic opportunities from me and my family, so I want to prevent them from coming over. Okay. One thing that helped their cause in terms of building up popular support is that Chinese people looked very different from the people who were already here. Okay, so Germans don't really look that much different from people who were people from Britain or had British ancestry. Although, by the way, that didn't stop people from publishing lots of nasty things about Germans, bringing over their beer and things like that. They were seen to drink a lot and possibly have some sort of foreign ties that could hurt the United States. So there was some anti-German sentiment. You probably heard about anti-Irish sentiment, tremendous amount of anti-Catholic sentiment, which continues to build up during this time. But there's no attempt to legislate restriction until the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay? So the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 to limit, or actually restrict completely, the ability of anyone from China, from the Chinese Empire, to immigrate to the United States. Okay? This is a political cartoon that was printed around that time. On the left there, in case you can't read everything, it says, notice. So there's the Golden Gate of Liberty. It says, notice, communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians. I don't know who those are. Maybe I should find out.
Fenians are Irish.
Irish, okay.
I'm a Fenian.
Hoodlums, but no admittance to China. And down here it says, the only one barred out, and it doesn't actually say who says this, but it says, the enlightened American statesman says, we must draw the line somewhere, Okay, so this was highly contentious because Americans, at the time, certainly thought that restricting immigration went against the very foundations of what the country was supposed to be about. Okay, and say, look, you're letting on all these criminals of various kinds, but we're just, you're drawing the line here at Chinese people for whatever reason, and you're holding back industry. These are hardworking people who could be helping our economy grow, and you want to keep them out. So it was quite contentious. But in most of the American East and South, there were so few Chinese immigrants that I guess they just went along with it. If you go and you look at the congressional record and see what people are talking about, there are people who have an ideological reason to say no. But the force with which people in the West were making this argument was so great that they managed to get it passed. Okay? And they said things like, well, it's not just because they're Chinese, it's also because they're all men, and they're not bringing their families, so they're causing crime. It's not just because they're Chinese, it's because they're bringing disease, and they would say nasty racist things, of course, like, oh, and they eat rats, and they're coming over here to completely change our culture, and we need to preserve something about America that's not just ideals, but also culture. Okay, and this is a argument that will continue all the way to the present day, of course. Okay. The Chinese Exclusion Act was supposed to only last for 10 years. It was considered a temporary measure. But in 1892, of course, it was renewed. Okay, there was no question by the time you got there. Everyone was very happy with the fact that, well, not everyone, of course, but most people were very happy with the fact that we were keeping out the Chinese, and they wanted to go along with it. At the time, there was a general feeling among all classes in the United States that immigration was a good thing for the economy, okay, and that it was a good thing morally as well. It's not just purely economic thinking, but it was a good thing morally as well. But the areas that we really started to see people speaking out against immigration were the sort of nascent American labor movement. Okay, so this American labor movement saw it as its job to protect the American worker. And here's a quote from early labor organizer Francis A. Walker. It does not matter in the least what the favored classes of the country think about immigration. The doors of this land will never be closed except upon the initiative and the imperative of the laboring classes, looking to their own interests and to the heritage of their children. So it was during this time period where this started to become a class issue. That is, if you were a working class person in the United States, you might have never had an opinion about immigration before. But now you start thinking, wait, aren't there just a limited number of jobs? And if people are immigrating here, aren't they taking the jobs from me? Don't I need to protect my job? Don't I need to protect my children's ability to work? You know, what happens, right now maybe the number of immigrants is okay, but what about in 20 years? What about in 30 years? What about in 40 years? What about my children? What about their heritage? So this movement became extremely anti-immigrant. Okay, extremely anti-immigrant, and it started to exert a bit of sort of political muscle at this time. Okay, still pretty early on in the movement, but started to exert a little bit of political muscle. At the time, the American sort of capitalist class was extremely pro-immigration still. And I guess the point of this quote is to say, look, we need to organize. We need to fight against all these pro-immigrant, maybe today they'd be calling them globalist conspirators or something like that. But you know, these people who want to let us keep it, bringing in Italians and Jews and people from Germany and Catholics. Remember, by the way, during all this time, there's no concern over Western Hemisphere immigration whatsoever. Okay, so it's all about Europe, and then also a bit about Asia. A number of laws would be passed in the late 19th century banning different groups. Japanese were banned, actually not by legislation, but by what we call the gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japan, where they sort of got together behind closed doors, and the Americans said, look, we don't want you to send any more immigrants here. You should prevent people from leaving Japan and coming to the United States. And the Japanese government said, okay, we'll do that. But don't pass a law that restricts anything. We'll just try to prevent Japanese people from immigrating. Eventually, Japanese people would be officially banned by the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. Okay, so that would actually ban immigration from everyone east of the Middle East. So everything in the Asian continent completely banned. But that wouldn't come until, say, 1917. The big push, and this is what I've actually written the most about, for an immigration restriction on the national level was a push for a literacy test. Okay? So the way that they promoted their anti-immigrant agenda was to say, we should have immigration, but it should be high-skilled. And to them, high-skilled immigration was, can you read? Okay, can you read and can you write a language? Okay, we're going to see if you have any kind of literacy, because the argument was, we don't want a bunch of people coming over and just becoming a public charge, is what they call it. People who can't read, people who can't work, right? So there were a lot of Americans who might have been very anti, banning immigration entirely, but were sympathetic to the idea of, well, people should be able to read and write as a minimum requirement. So the big push for this literacy test, and this would start in the 1890s. And 3 different times between 1890 and 1917, we had literacy tests pass it through Congress. Okay, and each one of those 3 times, it was overturned by presidential veto. And there were not enough votes in Congress to keep support the literacy test. Right? It's still a very contentious issue. So Presidents Taft, Cleveland, and Woodrow Wilson all vetoed different literacy test requirements. Eventually, they were able to overturn Wilson's veto and pass this literacy test. But it's a long battle. And this long battle involves building a coalition, political coalition, and this is where I draw a lot on the political science literature, a political coalition with the will to pass this law, which was seen at first by most Americans, and especially by the elites, as being extremely anti-American. Okay? So this cartoon says, literacy test, the Americanese wall as Congressman Bennett would build it. Okay? Uncle Sam says, you're welcome in if you can climb it. Okay, so I mean, there was no talk of building any kind of physical wall. But the idea here with this literacy test is you've got all these pens. You can't really tell if maybe those are fountain pens, but they look very sharp and very difficult to climb. And so a lot of people thought, look, even this minimum kind of requirement, I mean, we call ourselves the land of the free. So you're going to restrict a massive amount of people from coming in with this literacy test. The literacy test was not a great success, okay? And there are economic reasons why that is. When the literacy test was passed, the people who were responsible for paying to send people back, all right? So people come on the steamship, they show up at Ellis Island or wherever other port of entry, and they're given the literacy test. If they fail, they have to be sent back. And the people responsible for paying for that were the steamboat operators. And the steamboat operators were not interested in losing money, okay? And sending people back for free was losing money for them. So they had this ingenious plan where they actually very much taught to the test. They weren't really teaching people how to read and write, but they were teaching people how to pass the literacy test. So the literacy test was basically a joke. It didn't really slow down immigration at all. Because people were coming over, they knew how to pass the test. Doesn't necessarily mean they knew how to read and write, but they knew how to pass the test. And then the conditions in the economy were such that in most cases, I mean, not that there was always strong growth in the economy in the late 19th century. There were a number of panics and depressions. But in general, this is a period of immense economic growth, and there were jobs available for the immigrants. So the business classes, or the business owners were very happy with the system. The only people who were mad were politicians and people who had decided that they were anti-immigration. In one debate in Congress, after the literacy test was passed, one congressman was very, very irate, and he's like, all of our efforts are being stifled by these Jewish steamboat operators, okay, who only care about money and don't care about our culture or anything like that. So this type of talk was very common. Another group that became part of this coalition, other than the nascent labor movement, were the sort of progressive, they called themselves progressive at the time. I don't think current progressives would like any kind of association with them. They were highly into eugenics. Okay, so they were actually bringing these eugenicists into Congress to testify that, people from Scandinavia or Britain or Northwestern Europe of any kind, they're fine, but people from other areas of the world are scientifically inferior, and therefore they're destined to just become a drag on our economy. Okay, they would say that there are greedy businessmen out there who are willing to squeeze any penny they can, but it's going to destroy our nation, destroy our culture, because it's going to lower the quality of the stock. And these were not just sort of like fringe racists or something like that. These were professors from top universities who were called in as expert witnesses to support further restrictions, especially once the literacy test was shown to be highly ineffectual. All right, this is one of the slides that I'm really not sure about, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the technical work that I've done. All right, so one thing that I've done is try to study how this coalition was built. Okay, how do you convince a country that's extremely pro-immigrant, sort of as part of the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence? How do you convince that country to switch and become anti-immigrant? How do you build that kind of coalition? Especially because in places like the Northeast, immigrants were seen to have a pretty strong positive effect on the economy. And in places like the American South, there are basically no immigrants. Right? So people don't really, they don't know any immigrants, they don't know anything about immigrants. Their default was to say, okay, yeah, immigrants are fine. Like my ancestors were immigrants, so these are fine. They don't really affect me in any way. So how do you take people from the American South, for instance? Okay, all these S's up here represent Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats were originally very pro-immigrant. How do you switch them over? The two axes on this chart represent two sort of continuums of American political opinion at the time. So if you're to the left on this chart, each one of these represents a congressperson. If you're on the left of this chart, you're kind of what we would consider leftist on economic issues. That is, you want more government influence in the economy, possibly government ownership, definitely more government regulation. You're for some level of redistribution, something like that. And this is based on each one of these congressmen's voting record. Okay, what would we predict based on their previous record how they would vote on economic issues on future bills. On the vertical axis here, we have racial issues. Okay, so these start to become very, very prevalent in post-Civil War United States. So not just about immigration particularly, because a lot of the country doesn't care about that. Remember, it's not that they're pro or anti-immigrant, I should say, they're just apathetic. They don't really care about this issue. But they do care about other racial issues, like preventing black people from having civil rights. Okay, so this becomes a really big deal, especially in the American South in the Reconstruction period and then later on into the 20th century. And they built an effective coalition between Democrats, Republicans, and Southern Democrats to vote together on racial issues. Okay, so even if these people were very, very different on economic issues, okay, and you can see there could be a huge gap between groups on economic issues, they might vote together on social issues of any kind of racial type question. So during this time, we see a racialization of the immigration issue. It's not just purely an economic issue, and it's not an issue about, are we going to keep out Germans? It starts to become an issue of, are we going to keep out the Italians and the other Southern Europeans who have darker skin than us? Are we going to keep out the Eastern Europeans? Are we going to keep out the Jews? Are we going to keep out the Roma people? All these other people who are starting to want to immigrate because of the extremely low cost of travel, relatively speaking, and the very, very large place premium of moving to the United States. And it wasn't just economic premium. It's also, now you're starting to talk about people in the early 20th century really worried, especially as we get closer and closer to World War I, and then, of course, and then after World War I. So this is just one particular vote. This is the vote to overturn the literacy test. Okay? Vote to overturn the literacy test, which did, or overturn the veto of the literacy test, right, to confirm the literacy test, and shows that by the end there was extremely little opposition in either party, and it also was not really party-based. Nor was it based in any kind of economic conditions. It wasn't like areas that were particularly poor were anti-immigrant and places that were rich were pro-immigrant. It really did become a purely racial issue. So you had a coalition that was voting for restricting civil rights for American citizens who were not white, and they were also voting for all these anti-immigrant policies. And what was the result? Well, by 1924, you get the Immigration Act of 1924, kind of unimaginatively named. This Immigration Act of 1924 just said, look, we're just going to pass a law that says you can't immigrate to the United States if you're from various countries. How are we going to limit it? It's not going to be zero immigration from these countries, but we'll tie it back to the 1880 census. So if you go back to the 1880 census, you'll figure out, well, what percentage of people in the United States were from Italy at that time? Well, a very extremely small number, because at that time it was too expensive to move from Italy to the United States, and very few people are willing to do it. Okay, so the quota that was set, another name for this act is the Quota Act. Okay. The quota that was set was very small for people from Italy, for instance, or from any of the countries in Eastern Europe. So they were essentially trying to shut down entirely Southern European, Eastern European, and obviously Asian immigration entirely at that time. Although it still remained pretty easy to immigrate, like say if you wanted to immigrate from Great Britain or something like that. The next time immigration would come up, and I looks like I only have a few more minutes, and that's fine. The next time the immigration would come up in the United States was the Bracero program. Okay, so this is a 1940s, 1950s program to bring in laborers from Latin America, primarily Mexico, not to be citizens, but just to work in the American Southwest. And this was an extremely kind of popular program at the time because they absolutely really needed lots of laborers. It's the first time the United States has ever really even approached the question of immigration in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, this was not considered to be any kind of issue whatsoever. The Bracero program was very successful in terms of It caused a lot of economic activity. And since then, probably most of our debates over immigration have been referring to Latin America, which is, of course, there's a huge place premium, although that place premium has shrunk significantly in the last couple of decades for people who live in Latin America who want to move to the United States. The Immigration Act of 1965 was the first. This is when we're going to rehaul this Quota Act. And instead of having quotas from every country, we're going to link your immigration status to, do you have a family connection? And also, do you have necessary economic skills that are seen by, at least by legislators, not necessarily by business people, but by legislators, as being economically beneficial to the country. And this is the system that we still have today. I mean, obviously, it's not exactly the same as it was in 1965, but you can move to the United States if, for instance, you have a family member there, or if you have a Ph.D. or some other, or you're willing to invest millions of dollars or something like that. That kind of moves you ahead in line. And if you are, say, a Guatemalan peasant farmer who doesn't have any family in the U.S., then I mean you can get in line, but it could be hundreds of years by the time that's ever going to happen for you. Okay, because there are plenty of people who have family members or have a high level of skills who are immediately put ahead of you in line. In terms of the future, so here is President Trump signing an executive order in order to limit, I don't remember the exact name of the executive order, but in order to limit travel to the United States from a number of countries that are considered to be a high terrorist threat. This is, as you guys, I mean, it's really impossible to not know that it's a big issue today because it constantly shows up in the news. But the issues that we're talking about, like safety of Americans, and not just from violence, but from economic safety of Americans, protecting American culture, those types of things are not new issues by any stretch. Okay, they go back to 1800. And the pressures have changed, from time period to time period. The location of the immigrants has changed, but the underlying issues that are driving our debate have not changed since the beginning. Okay, they continue to be a big part of our political culture, and there continues to be a tremendous amount of disagreement about what to do. Okay, still, people will want to immigrate if there's an economic incentive to do so. So as long as the place premium for moving to the United States is high, as long as there are economic opportunities that are greater than people see in their home countries, they will want to immigrate to the United States. So it will continue to be a political issue that people debate back and forth. That's the talk. Done. So we've got 15 minutes for your questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Don't be shy.
The current, if anyone's curious about Nominate, which I know maybe wasn't it excites me, but maybe you thought that maybe it was too technical. If anyone's curious, this spatial analysis continues today, and you can go back to the beginning of the American Republic, and you see that there are usually two dimensions that are important. Right now, the dimension that seems to be important, other than economic issues, which is always a dimension that's important, is some kind of insider-outsider status. Okay, so are you a Washington D.C. insider, or are you some kind of outside reformer? And that seems to be a salient, outsiders on the different parties will often vote together on particular issues. You'll have bipartisanship for people who are kind of Washington insiders, and then you have that kind of pressure from the outside, people who are not Washington people, who are not career politicians. That seems to be a really important dimension that's developing now. Outsiders tend to be more anti-immigrant. Go ahead, thank you.
What do you think would be a fair immigration policy for the United States to adopt in the future?
I mean, that's a very good question. I personally am okay just saying everyone who wants to come can come. At least we can bring in more people every year, and then if it seems like it's being a problem, then we can start restricting it. But I mean, that's a personal opinion type thing. I've been very interested in finding what I call keyhole solutions. That is, solutions that address people who criticize high levels of immigration, address their complaints and take them seriously, but also address the fact that millions of people want to come here. But sometimes those types of solutions get met with a lot of skepticism. For instance, one thing that I'm really in favor of is expanding the work permits. Okay, so if you actually go and interview immigrants who don't have legal status in the United States, okay, so illegal immigrants of some kind, and say, do you want citizenship? Very rarely do they actually care about citizenship. But they would like to continue to work their jobs in a legal capacity and not have to be paid under the table. They would like to not have to worry about the constant threat of them or their family members being deported. Citizenship is extremely low. And then even when they are granted citizenship or amnesty or something like that, their rates of actually voting in elections is extremely low because it's just doesn't seem that it's very important to them. However, if you go and say, well, I want to expand work permits, but I don't want to expand citizenship, many people will push back and say, you're going to create a second-class citizenry. And I say, well, as opposed to now where they're still here, but they have literally no status whatsoever. But that's just not super popular. Another, what I call keyhole solution would be, look, why not charge for entrance? Okay, granted, that wouldn't help a lot of the poorest migrants, but it could be used to establish some kind of fund in order to compensate people who see themselves as economic losers from immigration. So maybe the biggest losers from immigration in the United States in the labor market are native citizens who don't have a high school diploma. Okay, I mean honestly, look, if you have a high level of skills, you're not worried about some Mexican construction worker, right, affecting your job at all. But if you have really low level skills that are comparable to a lot of the low skilled immigrants who are coming over, you might actually lose your job or have negative pressure on your wages. Okay, well, why not charge people who want to come here and use that money for retraining purposes, or to send people to trade schools in order to learn new skills or something like that. But that's another thing where it doesn't have a lot of political support because people say, oh, it's not fair to charge people. My response is always, wait, so it's more fair to just say you can't come at all? Okay, because that's what we're currently doing. Now, the United States has a pretty generous immigration system compared to a lot of countries that are in a similar level of economic development. It's just that there are a lot more people who want to come to the United States than almost any other country. So even though we're letting in a lot of immigrants, we're also keeping out more than any other country, right? Because there's still quite a large place premium for most people in the Western Hemisphere coming to the United States. You make so much more money. And as long as that's going to be the case, people are going to want to come here. So I guess coming back to your question, what do I think would be fair? I think the first step is expanding our work permits, especially agricultural temporary work visas, in order to people who are here working seasonally or living in constant fear of being apprehended by ICE. It just doesn't make any sense, at least not to me. They're working, they're not sort of collecting benefits or anything, so we'll see. We'll see what's popular. I mean, it doesn't seem like we're moving in that direction. It seems like we're going to move in the direction of more restriction.
I have the perception that the immigration restrictions are related to something that is happening in the society. For example, when the Chinese people was needed for building the rails or when they need immigration for the southwest of the country. Is that correct? I mean, that restriction is related to these kind of situations?
So that's what I thought at first. I thought that I would be able to predict support for immigration restriction purely based on economic conditions. But it doesn't seem to really match up. Usually a bad economic downturn will start a conversation about immigration restriction, but that even when the economy recovers, people, I think, and this is a guess, people start to think of that as a part of their political identity. It's like, okay, I'm anti-immigrant. So even when economic conditions recover, they remain anti-immigrant. So it's not the case that people are just sort of responding at all times to the current economic conditions. They might be responding to economic conditions from 10 years ago when they decided that they were anti-immigrant and they were going to support anti-immigrant politicians. So it's hard to make that connection, although I know that it must be part of, because we see downturns in the economy sort of sparking that anti-immigrant feelings historically, especially in the West. So that was my original thought, but it doesn't seem that a lot of the support for building a coalition that was anti-immigrant had nothing to do with economic conditions. So it wasn't like the American South experienced a depression and then they became anti-immigrant. They became anti-immigrant because they were told, if you become anti-immigrant, we'll vote with you to restrict, political rights for black people. It didn't have anything to do with the fact that people were in a bad economic spot. So, yeah, I was thinking that was going to be a very, very highly predictive, but it doesn't seem to be highly predictive. Even now that it's become a big issue again in the past few years, I've went and I've looked and I've seen, are the places that are most economically depressed, are those the most anti-immigrant places? And there doesn't seem to be any strong connection. Anti-immigrant sentiment is not really connected to it's not really predicted by your level of income. It's not like people lost their job and therefore became anti-immigrant. There would be some kind of sense to that, but it's more just like people, whether they have jobs or not, get the idea that immigrants are bad, and that becomes part of their political identity.
Immigration policy is national, and that's what you're thinking about. But is there much literature, do you know much about sort of incentives that states or towns have had to attract immigrants? And I'm thinking here, we're sitting here in a town that's about half the population than it used to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we could use more people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there are some states and some towns that have pushed for attracting immigrants. And I don't know if people have done much research on that.
Not to my knowledge, and I think that, like you said at the beginning, because the policy is national, that might be a reason why you haven't seen very much like that. Good question, but I guess you're thinking maybe certain areas that are...
Dayton, for example, I think, and I don't know too much about it, that's why I'm asking, but they had a push to attract people. I asked a question about this once here in Richmond in a meeting of community leaders, and people thought I was actually asking about trying to attract people to Richmond from Indianapolis. I was like, no, we're not really thinking about immigration from Indianapolis.
Yeah.
But there are places, and I think Indiana, for example, has a large population from Burma. I don't exactly know how that happened, but I don't know if that was an intentional thing.
So that mechanism, it might be working against the sort of, if an area is economically depressed, is that going to make them more or less favorable to immigrants? Well, if you're thinking we need immigrants in order to jumpstart our economy, but I think that the majority of people, this is just based on survey data, majority of people think that immigrants are actually hurting the local economy. So you could have some people think one way, some people think another way, and those are fighting against each other, and that's why you don't see a strong effect. So for everyone who says, look, things are depressed here, we need immigrants, there's someone else who says, things are depressed here, we need to keep immigrants out. So the two different things could be counteracting each other. Very good question. Wish I knew more about that. Anything else?
Our community has and this is true for virtually every small or medium-sized city in the Midwest. It's losing population, and I think you could get a very kind of moderate alleviation of that if we just had a more liberal and enlightened national immigration policy. But even in the absence of that, which I hate to say, I don't really see any good, route to getting there, given the political situation. But it's like a locality like Richmond could actually benefit a great deal if it was successfully able to draw in immigrants, for example, Syrian refugees, because if they couldn't come anyplace else, they'd all come here, and that would completely, overcome our loss of population, or at least it potentially could. But of course, I don't know if people would be receptive to that.
Yeah, I mean, some places they would, some places they wouldn't. I don't know if you could really predict if they would or wouldn't.
Well, I think Richmond itself is a very divided community, between town and gown, if you will, between the professionals and working class. I think that there's an attitudinal divide with regard to that. But certainly, to me, it depends on how it's framed. If it's framed in the interest of infusing new entrepreneurial energy or just adding to our community in general, I think that then it would be perhaps more acceptable. But you have to frame it in a way that's going to matter to both of those very different populations.
Yeah, it's tough, and it's hard to kind of present numbers and convince people with numbers, because one of the things I've worked on are the fiscal costs and benefits for local governments for letting in immigrants. And of course, you've got one group who they're showing numbers showing, look, immigrants are having kids, and those kids need to be educated, so it's driving up our K through 12 costs, not just in the number of pupils, but the fact if they don't speak English or something, that's driving up the per pupil cost. But then you say, well, you're talking about the cost, but aren't they going to grow up and get jobs and start paying taxes? Well, it sort of depends on which numbers you look at, whether that's going to be included or not included. So it doesn't seem like this is something that can be adjudicated by just looking at the data. People will pick their own facts that satisfy their biases. I know that sounds really pessimistic, but that's our world now.
In the interest of full disclosure, I'm an immigrant, but I think something interesting that you raised was, so you look at it as an immigrant as one mass group, but also if you look at immigration from a perspective, what I think Richmond would need, maybe people with some level of skill, for example, maybe not the highest skilled, because I don't think there is that many jobs here to be had at that level. But also, I actually just moved here from Southern California, from a county that has 50% population of Hispanic descent. And the common saying there is that if not, and a lot of them are actually immigrants, if not the immigrants, we would actually have to pay about $5 for a head of lettuce and maybe $7 for a pound of tomatoes or whatever. I think there is overall on aggregate kind of macro scale a lot of benefit of immigration.
Including low-skilled immigration. You're talking about.
Exactly.
If you go to the California Growers Association, they'll tell you we're letting some huge percentage, like 20% of certain crops, just rot on the vine because there's not sufficient labor in order. You say they could pay more, and of course you pay more, you're going to attract more laborers, but nobody's going to want to pay the high price for the vegetables. Alabama has essentially destroyed a big portion of their agricultural sector with some of their anti-immigrant laws, just because they say, look, you're massively driving up the wages for agricultural work, and nobody wants to pay those. I'll just buy my vegetables from South Carolina or something like that, right? I'm not going to pay 10 times more for Alabama-grown tomatoes. So it's. But I don't know that that's very convincing to people either. I don't know why.
I moved here from California also. One of the things I saw was that the immigration debate, you could say that there's just one, but anyway, debates, made for some very strange bedfellows, because you had the people who worked in the agricultural industry who actually ran these businesses, who one might expect, and just sort of stereotyping, would be sort of quite conservative and anti-immigration. They were right there with all the labor leaders pro-immigration. Or some of the labor leaders were. It was just all kinds of strange bedfellows, because absolutely they needed workers, and so it was interesting to see that.
So the question would be, as a result, we have, I don't know, I haven't counted, there are different numbers, 12 million, 15 million of illegal immigrants, if it's politically correct term. What to do with that group? How can they be integrated into the system? Because what you mentioned, I think above the injustice that is done to those people, another injustice is that they're not part of the system, they're not contributing to it as well.
I mean, I think the first step, like I said earlier, is sort of a blanket a work visa. If you're working, there's no fear that you don't have to live in fear if you're working. Okay, well, separate that from the citizenship issue, but it does seem it's extremely linked, and maybe rightfully so. Maybe people assume once you're given a work visa that's sort of indefinite, then the next step will be to fight for citizenship rights, and then it's going to be hard to prevent people who are permanent legal residents from ultimately making that happen. So hard political issue to convince people to budge even an inch on.
If no one has it, no, go ahead.
Are you done?
We can talk after.
You can talk, yeah. I think this is all the time we have for questions. Zach would be happy to talk to you guys afterwards. We should be having food outside, something to eat, so please join us for that. Thank you again.
Thank you all.